For much of history, power followed a simple rule: possess land, command armies, crown a king, and money will follow. Venice shattered this rule completely. It had no king, no fields, no knights guarding its borders, no vast countryside to feed an army. Just water, mud, and wooden stakes driven into a lagoon. Yet for centuries, emperors, popes, crusaders, and kings relied on Venice. Not for soldiers, but for something far more dangerous: money. Not gold, not coins, but for security. Venice didn't conquer the world, it financed it. And in the process, it quietly invented the financial system we still live in today. To understand how Venice transformed into a bank, you must first understand how peculiar it was compared to the rest of medieval Europe. Much of Europe was built on land. Land meant farms. Farms meant peasants. And peasants meant food, taxes, and soldiers. Power flowed upwards from land to sword, and from sword to crown. If you controlled the territory, you controlled the people. If you controlled the people, you could extract wealth. Venice couldn't play that game. It sat in a lagoon spread across small islands. The surrounding waters were both too shallow for large invading ships and too unstable for agriculture. There were no fields to tax, no castles to defend, no cavalry to deploy. Feudalism, the system that defined medieval Europe, didn't work here. So Venice did something radical. It built its power not on land, but on movement. Ships instead of fields, contracts instead of castles, ports instead of borders. From the very beginning, Venice survived by linking the economies of others. Goods from the Islamic world, spices from Asia, silk from China, metals and wool from Europe passed through Venice's hands. The city became a hinge between worlds that didn't trust each other, didn't share religion, and often didn't even share a currency. This made Venice valuable and, more importantly, necessary. In its early days, Venice was loosely linked to the Byzantine Empire. On paper, it recognized Byzantine authority. In practice, however, it acted more like an independent contractor than a vassal. As long as Venice kept trade and ships flowing, Byzantium looked the other way. The turning point came in 1082. A decree issued by Byzantine Emperor Alexios I changed everything. In exchange for naval support, Venice received extensive tax exemptions and special trade privileges throughout the empire. This was not charity. It was dependency. Byzantium granted this reward not because Venice was weak, but because it could not function without it. From that moment on, Venice ceased paying tribute and began to be rewarded for access. While other cities begged for royal favor, Venice bargained with leverage. It avoided crowns, thrones, and being a vassal of anyone. There was no king to depose, no royal lineage to manipulate, no ruler to seize. Venice ruled not by divine right, but by legal design. This is precisely where the social order begins to reverse. In much of medieval Europe, merchants occupied the lower rung of the social ladder. They didn't wage war. They didn't pray professionally. They earned money, which made them useful, but morally questionable. Profit was tolerated, not admired. Power belonged to the nobility who owned land and could raise armies. Venice never developed this class structure. There was no landowning aristocracy to dominate politics. There were no feudal lords collecting rent. The people who owned ships, organized trade, and managed risk were not outsiders trying to climb the social hierarchy. They were the hierarchy itself. From the very beginning, Venice's elite were merchants. Families who understood logistics, capital, and long-term planning. Success didn't come from inherited land. It came from talent, from surviving storms, keeping contracts, delivering goods on time across hostile waters. In Venice, economic skill wasn't shameful. It was proof of worth. This cultural difference was more important than any law. Because once merchants were no longer socially looked down upon, they didn't have to hide their wealth. They didn't have to convert it into land or title to gain legitimacy. They could invest directly in ships, infrastructure, and institutions. That's exactly what Venice did. Over time, the most successful trading families became a political class, not through revolution, but through normalization. Governance became something handled by people who managed complex systems and vast sums of money. The decision-making process prioritized stability, predictability, and continuity over triumph or conquest. This system was hardened in 1297 with a political move called the Serrata del Maggior Concilio, abolition of the Great Council. Membership in Venice's governing body was limited to certain families. Not warrior nobles, but established merchant houses. Political power became hereditary. Yes, but it was hereditary merchant power. Venice didn't create a blood aristocracy. It created a balance sheet aristocracy. And here's the crucial point that many miss. Venice didn't see this as corruption. It saw it as protection. Short terms for leaders, complex electoral systems, layered councils and committees, heavy penalties for abuse of power. The goal wasn't democracy in the modern sense. The goal was systemic stability. Venice didn't trust kings. It didn't trust crowds. It trusted processes. Once merchants began to rule, the state itself began to behave differently. It stopped acting like a warlord collecting tribute and began to act like an institution managing risk. The city was no longer merely facilitating trade. It was becoming something new, a place where money didn't just circulate, it was organized. A place where trust wasn't assumed, but engineered. A place where the state didn't sit atop finance, but embedded itself within it. This is precisely where the real transformation begins. Because when a government understands that reputation is its most valuable asset, it begins to treat money not as metal, but as a system. And Venice was about to transform that system into a machine. Once Venice understood that reputation was its most valuable asset, the rest followed. Most medieval governments treated money as a seasonal tool. They collected taxes when they could, plundered when desperate, and only borrowed when cornered. Debt was a sign of weakness, a last resort when treasuries were depleted and wars were already going badly. Venice reversed this logic. Instead of borrowing in panic, it borrowed by design. When the state needed funds to build ships, defend trade routes, or wage war, it didn't simply seize wealth. It extracted compulsory loans, called prestii, from its richest citizens. On paper, this seemed compelling. In practice, it was revolutionary. The state promised regular interest payments. These receivables were tradable. What began as a compulsory contribution quietly transformed into an asset. For the first time, citizens were not merely subjects of the state. They were also creditors. And once you hold the state's debt, the incentives change. You want the state to survive. You want stability. You want predictable policy. Chaos is no longer romantic. It becomes expensive. Venice didn't arrive at this by accident. It understood exactly what it was doing. Debt wasn't an obligation. It was a social contract, a way of directly linking the wealth of the elite to the very existence of the system. The richer you were, the more you invested in Venice's continued existence. Political loyalty was secured not by fear or faith, but by return. This was centuries before modern nation-states pretended to have invented it. And unlike many subsequent systems, Venice took this debt seriously. Payments were made. Defaults were avoided. Trust was aggressively defended because once trust was broken, the system would collapse faster than any invading army could. But debt alone wasn't enough. Venice also needed a way to move money efficiently without transporting gold across seas rife with pirates, storms, and rival powers. So Venice did something even more radical. It separated money from metal. In 1587, the city established the Banco della Piazza di Rialto Bank. It was a state-controlled bank designed to provide stability, not speculation. Deposits weren't piles of gold sitting in vaults. They were ledger entries, numbers recorded and transferred through trusted institutions. To a modern observer, this seems obvious. To someone from the Middle Ages, it was almost heresy. Money had always been physical, tangible, heavy, and vulnerable. Venice made it lighter, faster, and more secure by transforming money into accounting. Merchants could settle their debts without moving a single coin. Fraud decreased. Disputes diminished. Trade accelerated. This wasn't innovation for innovation's sake. It was risk management. Venice understood a fundamental principle. The one who controls the system that people rely on to fulfill their obligations rules the economy not by force, but by necessity. And Venice obsessively protected this system. Speculation was restricted. Rules were strict. Penalties were severe. Financial misconduct wasn't seen as cleverness. It was seen as treason. What Venice sold to the world wasn't speed or excitement. It was reliability. Venice chose slow growth rather than risk its reputation. It preferred predictable returns to explosive profits. In modern terms, it prioritized systemic stability over quarterly gains. Quietly, almost boringly, this system worked for centuries. This is where the story begins to feel unsettling. Because the system Venice built never disappeared. It moved. As Venice declined, its ideas migrated to Amsterdam, where merchants developed public debt markets. It moved to London, where the state learned to borrow permanently, not occasionally. It moved to New York, where finance became even more detached from physical constraints. Different cities, same logic. Today, nations prevail not because they possess the most gold, but because markets believe they will meet their obligations. Government bonds are backed not by metal, but by trust. Central banks don't just manage interest rates, they manage trust. When people say financial system, they are actually referring to a network of promises that everyone agrees to treat as truth. This agreement is fragile. Venice knew this. That's why it enforced discipline. That's why it ruthlessly punished breaches of trust. That's why it deliberately kept finance boring. Modern systems often forget this lesson. Today, debt expands faster than liability. Risk is privatized when things are going well, and socialized when they fail. Financial reputation erodes, is patched up, reassured, and occasionally covered with new promises. Nothing screams stable system more than the need for constant intervention to convince people it's still working. Venice immediately understood the danger because it also understood the other side of the equation. Stability comes at a price. Over time, Venice's caution hardened into rigidity. Its elite became conservative, protectionist, and resistant to change. Innovation slowed. New trade routes bypassed the city. That stability that made Venice strong eventually made it inflexible. The system survived, but the empire stagnated. And that's part of the lesson. Monetary systems don't just collapse when they fail. Sometimes they can decay even when they're doing very well, when preserving the structure becomes more important than adapting it. Venice ruled over money by respecting its limits. It failed when it forgot to evolve them. The deeper truth Venice left behind is unsettling but inevitable. Money is never neutral. It reflects who is trusted, who is protected, and who absorbs the losses when trust is broken. Systems built on trust can create extraordinary stability, but only if accountability is genuine and discipline is enforced. Empires collapse not when they run out of money, but when people stop believing that money means anything. Venice didn't conquer the world with armies. It shaped it by organizing incentives better than any of its contemporaries. It transformed trust into infrastructure, debt into loyalty, and finance into governance. Whether we accept it or not, we still live within the architecture it designed.